So we got a cry for help from someone whose ballots were coming back and saying that he was not conversational enough, that he sounded a little bit too over-polished and over-rehearsed, a little bit robotic. And so I have several tips if that's something that's a problem for you, if it doesn't really come naturally to you to give a speech conversationally. And it really depends to begin with whether you're having the problem with a platform speech or whether it's with something more spontaneous, a limited prep event or a debate event. If it's a platform speech, very often the problem is in the way you've written the speech. What you've done is you've written it like an essay, and you have not adjusted for the fact that spoken style is very, very different from written style. And if you take a written essay and you just commit it to memory and then you recite it, you are going to stilt and artificial, very distancing, and very often when people have made that mistake, the ballots come back and they say, not conversational enough, you left a barrier between speaker and listener. So what you want to do, there are a couple of things you can do. You can first of all check for sentence length, because in written style, the sentences tend to be a lot longer, they tend to be more complex. And very often, if that's the mistake you've made, there are a number of sentences that you can break into shorter chunks, even sentence fragments. Sentence fragments are not good writing, but they're perfectly acceptable speaking much of the time. The second thing you can do is go through and look for language that's very abstract, because when people speak, we're a lot more likely to use concrete language when we're in the moment and talking to another person who's in front of us. So try to substitute out as many abstract expressions with concrete expressions, or at least not as many as possible, because it can start to sound ridiculous, but at least to move it in the direction of more concrete language. And finally, it generally is a good idea when you're writing to use active voice over passive voice, but when you're speaking, it's downright important that you use active voice over passive voice. It's fairly unusual for people in conversation to use passive voice, so you want to root that out if at all possible. One really good exercise to do all those things at once is to write your speech up and then put the manuscript aside when it's still fresh on your mind, where the explanations, illustrations were. Maybe even you take the outline that you used to write the speech and you just talk into a recorder and you paraphrase it. You just explain your way through it, talk your way through it, not consulting the manuscript, but just putting it into your own words. And then you play that recording back and look for places where the wording is a little bit more spoken style than what you wrote into the speech, and then substitute it. And if the problem with conversational delivery is only happening with platform speeches, then give that a shot, and very often that can eliminate the problem. But if it's happening more often when you're doing impromptu, extemp, apologetics, or debate, then you may need to use one of the other drills that I've got. And I've got a simple drill, a more complicated drill, and then one drill that's for at tournaments. The simple drill, what you start off with is you make a list of different emotional states that you might want to convey at different points in a speech. And I have a starter kit of about 6. You can probably generate more, but there is warmth. Warmth is a good default. You want to convey to your audience that you like them, that you hope that they benefit from the speech, that there's some sort of connection and affinity between you. That's kind of the foundation of ethos. The second one is amusement. If you look like you're enjoying yourself, then that's contagious and people will enjoy listening to you. So being able to convey that you're interested and amused by what you're talking about is kind of important. A third one is concerned, especially in a debate, especially in a persuasive speech. You want to be able to talk about something as a problem, something as a burden. There's also sounding alert. If you want to talk about something as urgent, something as an imminent problem, something is a rapidly changing development, especially in an extemp speech, you want to be able to convey that you're very alert and on edge. Not for the whole speech, because that'll make people uncomfortable eventually, but for parts of it, you want to be able to sound very alert. A fifth one is you want to be able to sound surprised. This is especially important if what you're going to spring on your audience, if your explanation or if your example is something that they didn't see coming. Very often you prime them for that by sounding surprised yourself. And then finally, for our little starter list, sometimes you want to sound determined. Sometimes you want to sound as though you are putting your shoulder up to the wheel and nothing is going to turn you back from this position that you've taken. So those are all possible emotional moods that you might want to be able to convey with your voice and all the elements of your delivery. So write those down, make a list of them, and then what you do, this is kind of a fun drill, you take a food label and you just start reading off the ingredients, or you take any other string of kind of meaningless prose, it's got to be something that doesn't have any narrative quality. It can't really attract your attention, which is why we do it sometimes to amuse ourselves with food labels. So you say, partially hydrogenated soybean oil, lecithin, EHA, an emulsifier. And what your friend will do, what someone else will do, is keep calling out to you different emotional states and keep changing them. Keep trying to swing you back and forth between different ones. Maybe from amusement to alert to warm to concerned to determined. And it's possible that you might not really be sure what those sound like. So it's possible that someone who's got really good delivery might need to sit down with you and even play a little mimicking, a little role-playing back and forth. You know, when I want to sound concerned, my volume goes down a little bit, my inflection does this, and my eyes do this, and maybe my head movements come down a little. It's not as upright. Until you can start to recognize it and feel it and reproduce it pretty faithfully. And then you work this particular drill until you can switch back and forth between them, and all of those behaviors are more in your delivery repertoire. A second drill that I almost regard this as my Swiss Army knife of delivery drills, because you can do it with a lot of different things, but there's a version of it that works for encouraging people to be conversational with their delivery. And this is something that your coach should probably set up, because part of it needs to go on with you not exactly knowing that it's being set up. So you have a conversation with someone who's a very good friend that you can talk with very, very easily, and someone should record you. A video recording is good, but an audio recording can do about 85 to 90% of what this drill is supposed to do, and they only need to get maybe a minute or two. Then they need to get a recording of you giving a speech where you reproduce the problem, where you sound over-rehearsed or robotic. And after they make that recording, listen to it and see if you can't then exaggerate the problem, sound even more robotic, even more over-rehearsed. Now, not so much that it becomes silly, but to where it's recognizably the same thing that you're doing, but you're pushing it even further in that direction. Then what you do, you take the very first recording of you talking conversationally with a friend. You take the exaggerated recording where you're robotic and over-rehearsed and over-controlled, and in your mind, you treat them as a spectrum. So you try to morph from one down to the other. And what I do sometimes with my team members is I'll say, okay, that second recording, we're calling that a 10. The first recording of you talking conversationally, we're calling that a 1. Because when you have a conversation with a friend, you're not going to be big enough delivery-wise for you to give a speech that way. You're likely going to talk too quietly, and you're not going to enunciate enough, and your pitch is not really going to go. You're not going to use as much of your pitch range as you need to. So you'll need to pump it up a little bit, and probably the over-rehearsed, overly mechanical way that you're delivering your speeches, that's the product of you trying to pump up those delivery elements to where you can fill a room with your energy. And so if you can go from the over-rehearsed down to the conversational, then what you can do is try to pick a spot along that spectrum. Maybe between 10 and 1, pick a 3. And then try to stay at that 3 and talk at that 3. Give an entire impromptu at that 3 level or the 4 level. And find what's the sweet spot for you and get a little bit more of a feel for how much you should be taking those delivery fundamentals and using them to where you can really, your delivery becomes powerful enough, but it doesn't become off-putting. Now I call that my Swiss Army knife of delivery exercises, because taking one state and the other state and treating them as endpoints of a spectrum and moving back and forth between them, there are a lot of delivery mistakes you can correct with that. When I have to teach people who are naturally quiet, when it's time to teach them projection, very often what I'll do is I'll have them speak comfortably, and then I'll get to the other side of a parking lot and I'll make them yell. I'll make them yell instructions on how to make a peanut butter sandwich, and I'll keep doing this until they're loud enough that I can hear them easily, and I'll say, okay, that's a 10. The way you talk ordinarily is a 1. Let me hear a 6. Let me hear a 4. Because very often they feel intimidated and kind of defeated by the idea that it's just open-ended and they have to be deafeningly loud. And if I tell them, look, as loud as you can possibly be, the end point, we're going to back off from that several notches. That helps them a lot, and they get over the problem that they have of being too quiet. And then one other thing I occasionally do when I have students who are overacting a little too much or even underacting a little too much, I have them pump up the performance until it's almost grotesque, right on the line of being way too much. And then I have them give it kind of woodenly, kind of doing everything so subtle that none of the emotional choices are really noticeable. And then we work back and forth. And we figure out, do you want to be at a 3? Do you want to be at a 4? And this also gives me a little bit of a handle if they're getting on toward the end of the day and I can tell that they're running out of energy and they're starting to get a little bit flat. I can tell them, when you go in this time, don't do it at a 4. Try it at a 6 because you're going to need to compensate for where you are at this part of the day for your performance to be big enough and powerful enough to stand out from the other people who are in the finals with you. Okay, so the last of the drills, this is a drill that you do at tournaments. And this I think of as priming your empathy. And I've talked about very similar ideas in other settings because there really is a limited set of principles that underlie, and a limited set of practices that underlie good delivery. But this is a way of taking some of these principles and thinking of them just a little bit differently to help you to be conversational. Because the lifeblood of conversational delivery is warmth. You may have noticed that it's easy to be animated and to be a good conversationalist when you're around someone that you really, really like. Someone who you're on their wavelength, they're a good friend of yours, the words just flow. So what you try to engineer, and I will preface this by saying it's not going to work the first time you try it, so set your expectations accordingly. It's not going to work the second time, but if you keep at it, at some point it may click. And if it clicks, it will change entirely how you speak to audiences. What you try to engineer is you try to engineer a large part of that affinity, of that caring for that other person, even though that person is a complete stranger. So, if you walk in and your judge is making a lot of eye contact and smiling and generally being very encouraging, then that ought to be easy. Take one moment, look right at them, appreciate what a kind, warm, likable person this is. You've just made a new friend, and what you're going to do is you're going to show some warmth back to your friend and then start your speech. Now the trick, the challenge comes when you walk into a room and you've got someone who's completely foreboding. You've got someone who looks like a federal judge and they're just giving you the cold stare. Well, what you can do then, this is something I talk about in a lot of my different communication classes. We do not know what happens inside other people's heads and what happens inside their hearts. And what we do is we come up with attributions. We come up with little fictionalized stories of why people do the way they do the things that they do and why they are the way that they are. And what we can do, we have the choice of telling ourselves different stories. And one principle I'm a big believer in when it comes to effective communication is gracious attribution. When you make up the story that you think explains another person's persona or mood or behavior, try to come up with the one that makes it easiest to forgive that person if they're doing something that's in some way getting in your way, in some way harmful or disruptive, or if it's the kind of situation we're talking about where it's just a judge who's looking foreboding, then try to come up with an attribution, try to come up with a narrative for their life that makes it easy for you to have compassion for them and minister to them. So if it's a judge you've never seen before and they look completely stone-faced, they look completely unwelcoming, you know what you do? And you may have to think about this before this really clicks into place, but think about the fact they are out of their element, it may be their first time ever judging, and they are a little bit scared. Talk to your coach, talk to people who have judged for your club. You'd be surprised how often that is dead on. And if they are a little bit intimidated and a little bit frightened, you know what you ought to do? You ought to show them hospitality. You ought to show them it's okay. The caregiver in you ought to come out. This is someone, even if they are 20, 25 years older than you, this is someone who's maybe this is an early experience at a tournament. They're really scared they're going to blow something. They're really scared they're going to do something wrong. Maybe someone mentioned to them that it's important that they not show any bias or favoritism, so they're trying to keep their poker face on, but inside they're thinking, am I doing this right? Am I going to mess anything up? And you smile and you show them that you are happy that you're happy that they are your judge today and that you are going to take this presentation and you're going to make it meaningful for them, and you minister to them. So tell yourself, if you've never seen the judge before, that that poker face is hiding someone who's scared of doing the wrong thing. Now, what if it is someone that you know who judges a lot, so you can't really use your imagination to make that believable? Well, then maybe what you do is you tell yourself that that stone-faced judge is really kind of fatigued, is really kind of hitting the wall when it comes to forensics. And so then what you can do is you can tell yourself that you are going to minister to that judge by coming in, enjoying yourself, doing the best you can to be genuine and authentic, to be enjoying what you do, and you're going to put a note of life back into the judge's appreciation of forensics. And you don't have to be, I mean, I know that sounds incredibly conceited and, I'm going to show you what forensics is all about. That's not really the sense in which I mean it. I mean, and you can talk to the coaches and judges associated with your club, they can probably confirm this for you too. When you see a whole bunch of rounds, a certain level of, all right, I have seen a whole bunch of rounds can set in. But then someone comes along who really is just having the time of their life being there, and it's very obvious that competing in forensics is something that they get so excited about, and it just puts all the joy back in it for you. So you can see someone who's a familiar face, who's not showing you any warmth, as someone who needs that flood of joy let back into their experience of forensics. And if you do either of those things, either frame that judge as someone who is stone-faced because he's frightened, frame that judge as someone who is stone-faced because she's seen too many rounds and she needs her love for forensics reawakened, then what you can do is you can show some compassion and you can minister to that judge. And when you feel the imperative, when you feel the drive to convey warmth and welcome to that judge, and if you can get that warmth into your manner, that I think will take care of a large part of the problem of not being conversational. So, if it's a platform speech, see if it's a problem with you having gone too far in the direction of written style instead of spoken style. Try the ingredient drill and see if you can get more control over the different moods that you can convey. Try the spectrum drill and see if you can make a connection between your speech delivery and your conversation with a friend. And then finally, prime your empathy by taking a judge that doesn't look very welcoming and imagine for yourself an internal reality for them that makes it easier for you to minister to that person. Give those a shot, and if you've been having trouble, seeming unnatural, seeming not conversational enough, those may be ways that you can make some progress.